Japanese politics. We've been having a lot of fun over the past few months. We have an election. We now have a new prime minister to discuss her triumph, as well as the potential new hawkish international stance that Japan may be leading towards, ? We have back on Tobias Harris, author of the Observing Japan podcast. He also runs a little consultancy. You guys should all sign up. By the way, Lily Ottinger, ChinaTalk editor, will actually be in Osaka for the next week. So if you want to meet up, send her an email, lily@chinatalk.media. Last show we did, Tobias, we had Ishiba kind of on the ropes. There was like a ticking, there was basically a ticking clock on his prime ministership. Why don't you pick the storyline up from late July 2025?
Yeah, I think we talked in that weird interregnum where there had been some premature media reports saying that Ishiba was going, and then he denied them. And then you basically had this ratchet of pressure from within the LDP on him to leave. You know, that he lost 2 elections, he lost the LDP control of the Diet, and you know, how could he not take responsibility? He basically was able to push that off for about a month. Finally, in early September, the LDP basically released its upper house election autopsy. What went wrong? Why? What has happened that we're in this situation? And I think when you look at the overall conclusions of that report, basically it was, there was a lot of it was sins of omission, some of it was sins of commission, but basically that the bottom line of that report was the LDP has lost touch with too much of the electorate. Ishiba has not done enough to fix the situation. And of course, the subtext was that he was going to have to go. And so his situation at that point became untenable. And within a few days, he was out. And then into September, then we got, a relatively more subdued leadership campaign compared to last year. We had 5 candidates instead of 9. In practice, it really was a race among 3. It was shorter. It involved less crisscrossing the country. I think ambitions of the candidates were scaled back. I mean, it was a very different experience compared to last year. And of course, last year was not that long ago. So, the comparisons, I think, were very fresh and very apparent just how much the party had changed in a year's time.
And so who were our contestants?
Well, so all 5 had run last year. I mean, so that was the other thing. So it's, in some ways it was like, okay, well, we heard from all of them last year. What are they going to have to say that they didn't last year? And so we got, of course, the now new prime minister, Takaichi Sanai, ran again. Koizumi Shinjiro, who was Ishiba's second agricultural minister, he ran again. We got the now former chief cabinet secretary, Hayashi Yoshimasa, he ran again. You've got Motegi Toshimitsu, who had been a foreign minister and senior cabinet minister for much of the second Abe administration and into the Suga administration. He ran again. And then rounding out the group was Kobayashi Takayuki, the kind of young generational change candidate of the right wing. He ran again as well. And so you had all these familiar names. You had very familiar dynamics. And really, it ended up being a race between Hayashi, Takaichi, and Koizumi for the job.
So is this Koizumi dropping the bag? Is this Takaichi really blossoming this time around? How do you want to apportion the blame and the credit for how this election turned out?
So it's kind of a mix of all of the above, which maybe that's a dodge. But I mean, really, I think, there was a tendency when, so LDP elections, just as a quick refresher, LDP elections, when they, they have the option to do emergency rules, but they didn't do that. They just did a full election, which means that every dues paying member who meets certain qualifications gets to vote. And those votes determine basically proportionally how votes are distributed among the candidates. It's an equal number of votes cast by the party's national lawmakers, and that's the first round. If no candidate gets a majority, then it goes to a runoff. And so what ended up happening was that Takaichi, she's pretty popular with a plurality of the LDP's rank and file, and so she was going into the campaign really poised to do well. She ended up actually outperforming her polling, though, by anywhere between 5 and 10 points. And so that was, there was a pretty sizable polling miss. Either that, or I don't think there was a whole lot of polling in the last days of the campaign, and so it's possible that just like no polls have been conducted at that point, and you had a lot of late breaking voters, basically undecided to break for her. That's certainly possible. But even so, I think when you really look at it, Koizumi underperformed slightly. But ultimately, I don't actually think that's why he lost. I think he lost because he wasn't quite strong enough with the rank and file. And Hayashi ended up being a little too strong with the rank and file, because when you look at their combined vote, they ended up getting something around 47% of the vote together to Takaichi's 40%. So the kind of moderate part of the party just did a bad job strategically. Like, they actually, if they had decided, one of us just has to be the person, sort of, going to inherit the mantle of Ishiba, going to inherit the mantle of Kishida, carry it forward, we'll sort of join forces. I don't think Takaichi wins in that circumstance. A lot, before the race, there'd been a lot of talk about how, Kobayashi was going to hurt Takaichi's vote. That actually ended up not happening. Kobayashi wasn't really a factor at all. But Hayashi and Koizumi were both strong enough to hurt each other, but not strong enough to overwhelm Takaichi. And that, I think, really is the story. And in fact, I actually went and crunched the numbers too. Things could have gone very differently if you had swung maybe like 2,000 or 3,000 votes across the country, because it didn't just matter that Takaichi won overall, but also it mattered where her votes were distributed, because she had to, that basically in the second round, what mattered in the runoff was the number of you have 47 prefectures, you have 47 prefectural chapters, and each of those chapters has a vote in the runoff. And generally those votes are not generally, now according to party rules, those votes are awarded to the candidate who wins the most votes in each prefecture. Well, Takaichi won 36 of 47. But when you look at the margins, I think there was something like 11 where Koizumi was in 500 votes of winning.
Wow.
So one, that would have just given Koizumi more votes, but also a lot of the Diet members were following the results of the votes in their prefectures. And so you may well have had enough kind of on the fence lawmakers who look, well, okay, the voters in my prefecture voted for Takaichi, therefore I guess that's how I'm voting. So if Koizumi flips more prefectural chapters, it maybe looks different. It may be, is an even closer race than it ended up. It wasn't actually and it didn't end up being that close in the second round, in part because I think a lot of those swing voters in the second round ended up just going to Takaichi because she, won the popular vote. But it may be a different race if votes have been distributed a little differently.
So what are the kind of meta takeaways of this? Given that your argument is that there wasn't a sort of big shift in the electorate towards the right, is there like a structural problem with the LDP that they can't, or the moderates in the LDP, that they can't kind of get their act together? Do we just have like too big egos? Because of course we have too big egos, because these are people who want to be prime minister. What brought us down this path aside from a handful of coin tosses?
Look, Ishiba won last year, so clearly the kind of reformist moderate part of the party has strength. And in fact, one of the reasons why it was surprising that Takaichi won is that when you look at the LDP's electoral defeats last year and this year, those defeats were concentrated among the right wing of the party. The parts of the party that suffered most. The former Abe faction lost something like 40 or 50 members over the last two elections. So there was every reason to think that actually it would be difficult for Takaichi to actually even match her performance last year, because the parts of the party that she needed were smaller than they were last year. So she, it certainly looked as if she was coming in with a disadvantage. What I think ended up happening is not that there was a big swing to the right. So one, like we've established, that she won because of, she had a more unified plurality, and the other part of the party was divided. So I mean, in that context, I mean, she also had an argument that maybe was a clearer argument than uh, either Koizumi or Hayashi were making, which was, look, the reason why we're suffering is that the party has moved too far to the center, and we've lost the voters who were excited about Abe, and they've gone to Sanseito, and they've gone to the Democratic Party for the People. And the answer to our problem is simple, that we just need to shift back to the right. Those voters will return. We'll get them excited, and everything will be fine. Were enough voters convinced of that logic? I mean, I suppose you could say that. I mean, and I think Koizumi's answer was somewhat vague. I mean, I don't necessarily think he had a clear sort of one-line explanation for how to fix what ailed the party. I'm not sure, Hayashi, even more than that, as chief cabinet secretary under both Kishida and Ishiba, wasn't really in a position to say, well, we need dramatic change and everything has to, he was, I think, somewhat handicapped by, having to be the continuity candidate in the race. And so, in some ways, it's hard to beat something with nothing. And it's not that Koizumi wasn't offering nothing. It just there wasn't really like a clear, strong signal there that I think could match what Takaichi was saying. Now, whether it works, I think remains to be seen. I mean, I think there's real questions about whether that actually will prove to be a cure-all. But we'll see what happens.
Takaichi, who is this person? What should we know about her?
So she's been in politics for a long time. She was elected the same year that Abe was first elected, so 1993, the class of 1993, which now has produced Abe as prime minister. It has produced Kishida as prime minister. She's been around for a while. She actually spent some time in parties other than the LDP early in her career, because the 90s were kind of tumultuous and you had parties breaking and new parties forming, and the LDP was out of power when she actually first entered the Diet. So it was sort of a confusing time. She quickly, in the 90s, gravitated towards Abe as part of this emerging group of new conservatives, or young ideological conservatives who saw the end of the Cold War and the LDP out of power and the breaking of the economic bubble as really an opportunity to make a new kind of politics, to introduce some pretty wide-ranging reforms. And so she was quickly part of this group, wound up in the LDP, and really, I think, rode Abe's coattails in some ways in her career. I mean, she really was kind of pulled along, when he became prime minister for the first time, and then, she was around him when he was in the wilderness, and then when he came back, she ended up in important roles throughout his second administration. And so, he really was her patron. He really helped her along, sponsored her, when she ran for the leadership for the first time in 2021. He basically was her campaign manager. I mean, very much, she very much sees herself as committed to the same project, as carrying his work forward, dedicated to the unfinished task of Abeism. I mean, that's very much who she is as a politician. I will say, just as personality wise, and just sort of who she is. I mean, she's very different from Abe in a few, I think, important ways. One, unlike Abe, where Abe, he was a dynastic politician through and through. He came, grandson of a prime minister, son of a foreign minister, long-serving foreign minister who should have become prime minister. He was a political blue blood. It was who he was. He really felt like that he was, had inherited a political legacy that he was responsible for carrying forward. It helped him, really, move to the top of the LDP quickly. Takaichi was not that. She was, she's really, from a more middle class or working class family in Nara, had to, really rise on her own. There was an expectation that a college education, wasn't even appropriate for her. Her parents sort of discouraged her from going to Tokyo. She, really had to pull herself up and into politics. I mean, she was not helped along. She did not have a parent helping her along and pushing her into the family business. And so that makes her, I think, different in important ways. I think it gives her, in some ways, it gives her a more kind of approachable charm. It probably explains also, I think, the, pretty fanatical following she has among some of the grassroots. I mean, I think people really respond to her in ways that I think is quite genuine. Actually, I mean, she's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think, for parts of the party, I mean, I think they really respond to the fact that um, she is, I guess you could say, more salt of the earth, and I think that I think some people really find that appealing. I think the other thing about her, uh, she's really a policy wonk. She really um, commands, she really knows the details of a lot of different kinds of issues through and through. She likes talking about it. Like when she has these press conferences, she'll speak at length and really, really likes to get down into the details. Which in some ways is very, very different than Abe. I mean, I think, the thing that Abe, I think, liked most was really kind of the big picture visionary, this is the way I want to, take the country, and this is how I think about, what Japan needs to be. And I think with her, I find sometimes her sort of visionary kind of image spinning is a little derivative of Abe's. But where she is much more comfortable is when she starts getting into the details of policy. I mean, so she's a very, very different kind of politician, I think, in those ways.
Let's talk a little bit about having the first female prime minister. I mean, Japan has like a relatively low percentage of Diet members relative to other democratic countries around the world. I mean, is it not surprising that your first female PM comes from the right wing? Like, how are we putting all this together?
Well, I mean, just given that the number of non-LDP prime ministers since 1955 is a very small number,
Sure.
The odds obviously favor someone from the LDP. Yeah, I mean, the number of the LDP in particular, I mean, I was looking at these numbers today. So the LDP has 38 female lawmakers between the two houses of the Diet, which is less than 10% of its 395 lawmakers. And now apparently between cabinet and sub-cabinet posts, basically a little more than 25% of those female lawmakers are now in the government in some form. So it's there aren't a lot of women. There's something a little sui generis about Takaichi's path. Many, look, there aren't that many women who have endured as long as she has, who have successfully, navigated the LDP's politics to, get to the position where she was actually able to contend for the leadership. I mean, there haven't been a whole lot of female candidates for the leadership in the first place. Did she get there entirely on her own? I mean, I think clearly she needed Abe's patronage. I don't think she gets to where she gets without Abe sort of giving her, positions, when he was able to do that. And that's not to diminish her political talents or, her capabilities, that I think she is, she is a capable retail politician. I think, again, she has, really strong command of a lot of different policy issues. She's, formidable, but the LDP being what it is, I don't think that was sufficient to get her to the top. Unfortunately, I mean, and that's just the reality that I think, and I think, subsequent, the next, whoever the next female prime minister ends up being, maybe we'll be able to do that, by being a power in their own right and not someone who, needed, and Abe to pull them along, or maybe Takaichi ends up being that patron herself. And I think, one thing to look at, is how she's using, less the cabinet post, because she only 2 of her 18 cabinet members are women, but a little more of the sub cabinet posts are sort of the younger generation of women. So clearly I think she sees herself as being in a position to cultivate kind of the next generation of female talent in the party and to give them the opportunities to develop those skills. So they're not as dependent on, here's a powerful man who's using his, abilities to help her, his power to help her along. So it's a little different, I think. And, I think it just reflects the time that she was coming, that she was coming of age in Japanese politics, that, that was her pathway.
She's married to a parliamentarian who brought 3 kids from a prior marriage. Are any of them in politics? Are we getting Is there a dynasty in the making already?
I I don't get the sense that that's what she's trying to do, but I guess if your parents are both, or if your father and stepmother are both Diet members, I guess the chances that you might be drawn into politics are perhaps high. Although, it's like, I think sometimes, like Abe's older brother, was exposed to it and hated it and wanted nothing to do with it. So, it's possible that they might just find the whole thing so repellent that, yeah, that no interest. I mean, I think maybe just one more note about Takaichi herself. I mean, I think, she is, I mean, she is a thoroughly political being. I think she, is just so steeped in it. I think it really is her life in a way that, yes, there's sort of, lots of stories about her hobbies and how she's a fan of the Hunchin Tigers and she likes cars and she had been a heavy metal drummer and all that. But ultimately, I mean, I think this is someone who really is just so thoroughly in the arena. I mean, in a way, a lot like Abe was, as well, that, there's sort of, like Ishiba teased her for her work ethic, and the fact that she, is, really tireless and keeps long hours and, is just really devoted to doing the work. And, I think that really is who she is as a politician in a lot of ways.
Let's talk about some of her policies. Let's start with international relations, national defense. What's remarkable about her agenda, Tobias?
Well, she is a hawk through and through. I think there's really no question about that. I mean, this is someone who, I think she sees the world as dangerous, which, I think is pretty much a consensus position in Japanese politics now. But I think she sees it with a greater urgency and has, sounded the alarm for longer. Sees, the risks that Japan faces from kind of being on the front lines, facing off against three nuclear armed states, right in its neighborhood, and working increasingly close together. I think she sees, she just sees a world of challenges, and that's, traditional military threats, but it's also food security, it's energy security, it's economic security, it's supply chains, it's all of that. I mean, she sees lots of threats that Japan essentially has to steel itself against, harden itself against. And that, I think, both last year and this year, I mean, when you look at how she has campaigned, I mean, that really has been the essence of her campaign, that we need a strong Japan because it's a dangerous world, and I'm going to do what it takes to meet those threats.
ChatGPT told me that one of the kids is a prefectural assembly member in Fukui.
The prefectural assembly is usually a stepping stone to national politics, so wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, like 40 years old. And ChatGPT can find basically nothing about the two daughters. So good for the Japanese press, keeping them under wraps. I don't know. Will it stay like that? I mean, if you're...
Yeah, I mean, in general, like like the first ladies, the family, like they just generally aren't in the spotlight nearly as much as, say, in the United States. When family members of prime ministers wind up in the press, usually it's because something has gone wrong. So, Abe's wife, Akie, she was involved in this scandal, with a school getting, a sweetheart deal on some land, and she was a patron of it, and so that like resulted in a lot of pretty unfavorable attention on her and some of her associations. So that wasn't great. There was a scandal with Prime Minister Kishida's son, who had been was working as a one of his father's aides, basically using government resources to go on shopping trips and things like that. Like, so generally speaking, when the children of leaders have been in the, have been in the public eye, usually it means things aren't going well. Something's wrong.
Just the split screen of like Kamala's kids or
Yes.
and how out there they were. I mean, Biden's grandkids as well. It's like
well, maybe it tells you that America doesn't have a monarch, and yet treats its president's families and presidential candidates' families as more like royal families than Japan, which actually has an imperial family. but then I guess, the imperial family, of course, gets lots of press coverage, and the goings on of the imperial family itself get lots of attention. So, I guess the media focuses on that instead of the family of who's the head of the government.
What is her vision of manifesting that, and how, if at all, does it contrast from our most recent two prime ministers?
So I think when you look at what she wants to do, I mean, I think a lot of it is putting Japan strengthening its capabilities first before anything else. And so, before even, cooperation with the United States, before even cooperation with other countries, that Japan has to do a lot more to defend itself. And that's going to mean more defense spending. That's going to mean, efforts to strengthen the self-defense forces, acquire new capabilities for the self-defense forces. One theme that she's been pretty insistent on for some time now is Japan needing like a proper, like equivalent of the CIA. Like you need like a true like national intelligence director, because now Japan is basically disparate intelligence functions that are sort of spread in different parts of the government. She wants, a intelligence agency, directly under the cabinet, and the prime minister that, basically at the same level as the national security secretariat that they created at the beginning of Abe's second administration. So basically you'd have the national security advisor and, I guess Japan's DNI, maybe you'd say. She, like feeling that Japan has a real deficiency in its intelligence gathering and analysis capabilities, and that it needs to do more. I mean, so things like that. There's just, a whole range of steps that need to be taken to raise Japan's capabilities to just another level, to complete the work of making Japan, to really giving Japan a full national security establishment. And I've argued in my book, argued in other places, that building that national security establishment, was one of Abe's goals and one of his accomplishments. But clearly, there was more to do. I mean, it took Kishida to get defense spending, raised to another level. There's, the intelligence apparatus questions are were not really addressed during the Abe years, I think, in a systematic way. I mean, so there's more to do. And so she, is, I think, poised to move that to another level.
And we've got Koizumi as defense minister?
Yes, we do. Which is not bad for him in that, his resume, he's done agricultural policy. He's been the environment minister. He's done a lot of work, more in a party capacity on Social Security reform. Has not really had, the foreign and national security policy portfolios. He is not necessarily a defense policy expert. I mean, what we have seen in the defense ministry over the last, several years is, they generally have been drawn from, you have these, in the LDP, they're called policy tribes, like basically like the groups of specialists in different policy areas. And generally, the defense ministry has, for the most part, with maybe a couple of exceptions, been drawn from those ranks. Koizumi is not in those ranks. He is not one of them. He would probably say that because he comes from, his district is Yokosuka, where you have a large U.S. naval base and a large Japanese maritime self-defense force base, that, there's sort of an innate understanding of defense issues that comes from just, being in the constituency and having to work with military authorities. But he's going to be doing a lot of work to get up to speed on it. And, is really going to be in a position of, there's a couple big, there are big questions with the United States, signaling to the United States about Japan's ability to spend more on its own defense. We're going to be coming up on host nation support talks in the not too distant future. I mean, these are big issues coming, and so he's gonna have to step it up.
And what was her calculus putting him there?
Well, she wanted to. I mean, both Hayashi, Motegi, and Koizumi are all in the cabinet, and Kobayashi is in a senior party post. So, I think in the interest of party unity, she wanted to keep all of the, rival candidates on side, to try to head off, some sort of anti-Takaichi movement that could be headed by one of them. It's a lot harder for them to you know, you know, so the Lyndon Johnson line about wanting your enemies inside the tent. So um, that I mean, ultimately, I think giving them work to do, keeping them on board, forcing them to be part of the work of making the Takaichi government a success. It's something. I mean, Abe did it as well. He always was trying to co-opt his would-be rivals, and so this is an old technique.
I guess more from the perspective of the can we be serious on national defense if we have Koizumi running the defense establishment?
I mean, I don't look. It's a parliamentary system, and oftentimes you get people doing different jobs and kind of building up expertise on their way up. There are very few political appointees in any ministry, so there's there's a lot of dependence on bureaucracy. Of course, increasingly there's a lot of dependence on uniformed self-defense forces personnel. All of that is just part of it being a parliamentary system. That you do the jobs and then you acquire the expertise and the experience. And if anything, if it goes well, I mean, he can end up in a position of, okay, well, now he has this expertise in addition to the other things. And so, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily cause for alarm, any more than, I mean, I think there might be some other more concerning cabinet appointments that we could talk about, maybe not less from a national security standpoint. So no, I think, I think if you listen to some parts of kind of the Japanese commentary, there's this idea that Koizumi somehow, he's not smart. He can't
lightweight.
Yeah. And I mean, I frankly just have never understood that line, that I think if anything, he has really from the moment he arrived in the Diet has been very much, reluctant to buy his own hype and has repeatedly shown a willingness to put in the work, and to do sort of not particularly glamorous jobs and to take on things that, are not the most kind of high profile positions. And in some ways, we saw this when he became agricultural minister earlier this year, that deployed correctly his sort of star power and his sort of media ability to command media attention can actually be useful. That he takes over and the government had been dealing with this rice price crisis, and he immediately throws himself into sort of high profile measures. I'm going to sit down and talk to retailers. I'm going to just sort of using his ability to command media attention to actually move the government's agenda. So there's, I mean, deployed correctly, he could be a real asset. And so I just think there's a tendency to write him off, because, he's just a pretty face. But I don't actually think that's true. I think there's, he has shown an ability to learn and to do the work and to, to try to become a more kind of well-rounded political leader.
Well, I'll give him 6 months to bone up, but we'll be expecting a ChinaTalk appearance. Apparently, he does speak halfway decent English, so
yeah, he does.
The offer is outstanding. We won't go straight for the PM. We can start with the defense minister. Other remarkable aspects of her cabinet announcement and first few days on the throne.
Well, I mean, I think we can just talk overall about the cabinet. And this is, goes back to her including Hayashi and including Koizumi in it. There are a lot of different philosophies about forming a cabinet, and Ishiba ended up really relying on, friends and allies. It was, and in some ways it might have done him in, that he, did not really reach out to Takaichi to give her a high profile job. He did not really reach out to the right wing of the party. I mean, his cabinet was very much, I want to be in power with the people I trust most. I feel like I can't trust anyone else. And so it ended up being, Ishiba surrounded by his lieutenants. And, I don't know if that really did him any favors, ultimately. And it meant, a lot of the most vociferous opponents of him were, not in jobs that restricted their ability to speak out. And so, he, ultimately, had this sort of pretty persistent block of the party that had nothing better to do than to criticize how he was governing. And so that didn't, I think, work well for him. Takaichi, I think, recognizing maybe that her victory was not as overwhelming and preponderant as perhaps it seemed, and so reached out to Koizumi and Hayashi. There's a pretty broad balance of distribution among members of various former factions, all different stripes. This is not just a bunch of right wingers necessarily. One thing that I have flagged, though, and I think this is just when you know how Japanese governments work, the composition of the cabinet matters a lot for political reasons, but when you want to look at how the government's going to actually work, you have to look at the prime minister's office and who's in the jobs that are sort of most immediately around the prime minister, because that is going to tell you who the sounding board is, who's going to be sitting around the table making decisions, setting priorities, who's going to be delivering, sort of the will of the prime minister directly to the bureaucrats, who's going to be, basically deciding how the government communicates its messages to the public. And that group is much more conservative. The people, her chief cabinet secretary, her deputy chief cabinet secretaries, the sort of aides and advisors, they are much more uniformly from the right wing of the party. And so, cabinet posts, she did the kind of politically expedient thing and brought in, rivals and brought in people who had to be rewarded. But when you look at who's actually in some of the key decision-making roles, it's a much more conservative group.
How are you expecting her being conservative and her team being conservative to manifest?
The most obvious thing is, it's going to be on a couple issues. One, it's national security. Look, to some extent, there's a consensus, right? Kishida was the one who, got the deal done to get defense spending to 2% of GDP in the first place. He pushed, changes through that allowed Japan to acquire strike capabilities. So there's a pretty broad consensus in the party. This is not necessarily a conservatives versus moderates kind of issue. So to that extent, will having this sort of conservative team maybe give it more of an edge, maybe a little more stridency, maybe a little more willing to push harder and faster? So she's already talked about how she wants to move up the timeline for revising the 3 strategy documents, which outline, among other things, a 5-year plan for defense spending. So that would not, on the normal schedule, would not be until 2027. She's already said, in her first press conference yesterday, that she wants to do that sooner. So that's something that's something that Ishiba was not talking like that. Had Koizumi or Hayashi won, I don't think they were going to be talking like that. I think that the tone is different on that score. In general, in some ways you can just what is she doing that Ishiba was not doing? So, pressing on the gas pedal on defense. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing, to be a conservative in the LDP now is to be a fiscal dove, and she's tried to tone back some of the rhetoric. Last year she ran as practically like a modern monetary theorist, and this year she tried to trim it back a little bit and at least gesture in the direction of fiscal responsibility. But fundamentally, I think she still thinks the deficits don't really matter, that there are urgent needs, and if it means we have to run bigger deficits so that we can spend more on defense and other things, then we'll do that. And so that is something that absolutely is a difference between her and pretty much any other candidate who might have become prime minister. Everyone else was much more cautious about it. Ishiba has been very cautious about it. If she's now, the question of whether she's going to actually be able to get away with that, given the condition of the bond market already, and the fact that I think you have the bond vigilantes are keeping a watch out. That's going to be, I think, one of the major questions that determines her durability. But that's a major difference, and I think it is something that is going to color how she governs. Other things that I think, might make her different. I mean, I think clearly, even though I think, the consensus both within the LDP and across parties on kind of foreign population issues have changed. She centered that in her campaign more than any other candidate. Talking about the need to get foreign tourists to behave themselves more. Really cracking down on law breaking by foreign residents. I mean, she took a much more strident stance on that. Has already basically created a cabinet portfolio to deal with these issues. Will likely be setting up a kind of headquarters to oversee these issues. I mean, she's gonna move in a more strident direction on those issues. Also, partly because she's trying to head off a threat, from the LDP's right, from Sanseto as well. I mean, he really has to have an answer on these issues, and so that's also something where I think she's going to lean into taking a more hawkish stance on those issues compared to some of the alternatives.
We jump forward to her policy agenda. I mean, she doesn't have a ton of LDP members. She's in a coalition government. She swapped. We have a new partner. What's that dynamic like? How stable is this all likely to be, Tobias?
Well, I mean, we have to step back and just, this has been, this is, one of these months where like a decade's worth of events seem to have happened. I mean, it's been, really from the moment that she won on October 4th, a week later, less than a week later, 6 days later, you had the end of the LDP's 26-year-old coalition with Komeito, which, a centrist, nominally pacifist Buddhist party that has supported the LDP both when they were in government, but then also during 3 years in opposition as well. That coalition broke down. And, to some extent, the writing had been on the wall for a while because Komeito's electoral strength had been declining. There were plenty of people on the right of the LDP who had, I think, tired of having to rely on this party that consciously described itself as a break on some of the LDP's more right-wing tendencies. So there had been, I think, a sense that if not now, sooner or later, the coalition was going to break. But it immediately created a problem for Takaichi by not being able to bring Komeito into the government, because it meant that instead of going into the vote for the prime minister with a minimum of 220 votes, 13 votes shy of a majority in the lower house, she was instead 37 votes shy, which was a much trickier challenge, and it created at least a window of opportunity for a group of opposition parties to try to organize a campaign for someone else to become prime minister. And I wouldn't say it almost succeeded. I mean, the talks got started. They looked like they were maybe making progress on overcoming some of their policy differences. It ultimately did not succeed, and it did not succeed because the LDP actually did manage to pry away one of those opposition parties, which was Isshin no Kai, the Japan Innovation Party, this Osaka-based. It's been described a bunch of different ways. I think you could call it neoliberal. You could call it kind of quasi-populist. You could call it, conservative, whatever term you want to use to describe it. But basically, Isshin had been in these talks to possibly elect Tamaki Yuichiro as prime minister. Then they got a call basically from the LDP and said, "Yeah, we'll talk to you." And within a couple days, it became pretty clear that there was going to be some sort of arrangement between Isshin no Kai and the LDP that would ensure that Takaichi would become prime minister.
How do these? Sorry, what's my question? Like, are they just like hanging out in bars? I mean, how is this actually going down in real time?
I mean, there's a lot of that happens in Japanese politics. You go to the, sort of in the back alleys behind, the back alleys of Nagatacho and Akasaka near the Diet members' offices building. I mean, there's a lot of business that gets conducted in various drinking establishments in those back streets. So, do they exclusively happen there? Not necessarily. Some of it is just, formal conferences, and some of it is, text logs back and forth, and just, kind of surreptitious messages like that. I mean, I think my understanding was that actually the dialogue with Takaichi and Ishin did start with a text and then, led to kind of more formal discussions there. But yeah, I mean, it's, it's politics. Politics is politics, right? It's the same anywhere. So, yeah, I mean, those talks, I mean, but the thing that was uncertain. I mean, Ishin's a weird party, and I will freely admit, like I always struggle with them just because I don't know Osaka. Like, my time I've spent loads of time in Tokyo. Every time I've lived in Japan, it has been in the greater Tokyo area. I've been to Osaka, but never for that long, and so I mean, Osaka is just kind of a mystery to me. And Ishin no Kai as a party that now like essentially has almost a monopoly on power in Osaka and sort of greater Osaka. Um, it has really for like 15 years now. Um, I mean, I don't entirely understand how they've been able to make it work because they've just had, and you're welcome to link to this maybe in the show notes or something. Like I wrote a review, I read a book, because I was trying to learn more, a Japanese book that's just sort of on the history of sort of the first decade of Ishin, and trying to understand their sort of ups and downs, because it just seems like they've had these periods where it looked like they're booming, they're going to expand nationally, they're going to become like sort of a major third party, they're going to challenge the LDP from the right, and then eventually kind of everything collapses and they retreat to Osaka and they have to fight to hold on in Osaka, and then a couple years later they get sort of another boom. I mean, and this has happened like 2 or 3 times now in their history. So, I mean, it's a very strange party. I don't understand how they've been able to endure in Osaka itself to the extent that they have. But that's who the LDP is now relying on. It's not a straightforward coalition relationship. It wasn't a 1-for-1 swap because Ishin decided they didn't want to actually take any cabinet post. So they have this, external cooperation agreement where, I mean, if you look at the text, as far as I know, all they promised to do was to vote for Takaichi to become prime minister, which they did. But now they basically are in a position to say, oh, you're not doing, like, you promised to do all of these policies, so there's like this like lengthy document listing all the policies that the LDP has now promised to implement. And in some cases, I mean, in most cases, the promises are kind of vague, we'll study this, we'll, set up a headquarters or committee to study that. But some of the promises are very specific and have very specific timetables. And if the LDP backs away, the barriers to exit for Ishin from this arrangement are very low. And I should note already, it has been 2 days. They signed this on Monday. It is Wednesday. And you have already had one of the leaders of Ishin coming out and saying, if we feel the LDP is not living up to its bargain, we will leave the coalition. So here we are. It has been 2 days. Takaichi has been prime minister for 1 day, and her coalition partner is already threatening to quit. So,
what happens if they do?
I mean, in practice, nothing. You just have a minority government, and like technically now, I mean, they have a minority government also in that. Unlike in other democracies where you have minority governments that have these sort of external partners, this isn't, as far as I know, I mean, and I've not seen anyone suggest otherwise, this is not a confidence and supply agreement. Ishin has not promised to, side with the government if, there was a no confidence motion. It has not promised to vote for the government's budget. I mean, all of its support is conditional. It is entirely conditional on a feeling that the LDP is, acting in good faith to hold up its end of the bargain and actually implement these policies that Ishin says it wants done. So, in theory, they could leave and Takaichi's still prime minister and it's not like her government would collapse. But then the question becomes, like, is Ishin, do they feel bitter over the LDP's breach of faith and therefore would be willing to support a no confidence motion? Like, what, that really becomes the question. And if it were to happen before the budget passes. I mean, I think now we can at least, even if it's not written in stone, I think we can presume that, the assumption will be that when it comes to passing a budget next year, you know, the Ishin will be favorably disposed to voting in favor of it. And of course, the priority when it comes to drafting the budget, they'll be listening to Ishin. They'll be ensuring that Ishin's preferences are included in the budget. That'll be the government's inclination. If Ishin is dissatisfied before then, all of that maybe is up in the air. What does the budget look like? Where will the LDP get the votes it needs to pass a budget? That immediately becomes the most important question. But that's only if for some reason Ishin were to leave before, late March. If things hold together through late March.
Play this out, Tobias. Okay, the LDP or this coalition splits off. It's a minority government, and they can't pass a budget. Do we get elections? What happens next?
I mean, if things are so bad that they can't pass a budget, yes, I think we'd get a no confidence motion that passes, and that would presumably trigger an election, and they'd kind of fight it out. That would be my presumption. If the relationship with Ishin broke down to the point that it really was willing to entertain a no confidence motion. And I mean, passing a no confidence motion, I mean, there's a reason why Ishibo actually didn't face one. And that is that, only, as of now, only one party, the Constitutional Democrats, are big enough to actually submit a no confidence motion independently. And they were reluctant, and no other party wanted to take the lead on that. And so Ishiba kind of escaped without one. So you still have to get all of the opposition parties on sort of the same page on, this is the time to do it. Let's do it. Everything is right. And so also it depends, how popular is Takaichi? Are things going her way? Presumably, if the coalition falls apart, it's probably a sign that things aren't going very well. So, there's no guarantee of any of this, but presumably that would be the mechanism. And the possible trigger, I mean, the reason why you already had one of Ishin's leaders threatening to quit the coalition is that they made a couple of compromises with the LDP, and they're compromises that not only are potentially complicated for kind of internal unity in Ishin Nokai, but also they could result in a lot of friction between the LDP and Ishin Nokai. So the reason why the LDP and Komeito broke up, fundamentally, I mean, there were a lot of reasons that had been building up for a long time, but like the most proximate trigger was this like lingering question of the political finance reform. This was, the fallout of this slush fund scandal that destroyed the factions, at least, nominally, and, really dragged down the LDP support. And the party, was supposed to really commit to tightening up regulations on donation, basically like who can donate, who can receive donations, how should they be reported. And so earlier, basically at the start of this year, there'd been some pretty extensive debates between the government and the opposition parties about what that should look like. Those talks ultimately broke down because on the one hand, you had parties like the CDP and Ishin, keep a pin in that, calling for basically a total ban on corporate political donations. The LDP saying, well, no, we can't do that. Like that's too much. But we should have a bunch of rules to, increase transparency, much more, accessible reporting, but, lower thresholds for reporting and things like that. And then you had sort of this middle solution, but that Komeito and the Democratic Party for the People came up with, which was, well, we don't want an outright ban, but it's not enough to just do more transparency. Let's limit the organizations that can receive donations. So instead of like every politician has their little fundraising support group, if you want to give, if corporations want to give money, it has to be to either the national party or a prefectural party. Like that was sort of the compromise proposal. And in the coalition talks, Komoto said, hey, we have this proposal. We want you to sign on to it. We want to make this happen. Takaichi generally has just thought, that the LDP didn't have to reform anything. Nothing. This was not a real issue. This was not a serious issue. It might also have something to do with the fact that the right wing of the party is where the slush fund scandal originated from, and the people implicated in it tend to be her supporters, and so she, I think, was maybe constrained in taking a more aggressive approach to this issue. And so that ultimately is what led Komoto to say, okay, fine, we're done. We can't join the government because you won't sign on to this. And so enter Ishinokai, and Ishinokai has an even more hardline position on this, right? And enters talks, and the LDP is like, we just pushed away our longtime coalition partner who was offering a more modest proposal. So I'm sorry, your proposal for a total ban is a complete non-starter. So Ishinokai says, okay, fine.
Why do they want money in politics? Why do they want corporate money in politics? How important it is? Why is it important to the LDP?
Elections are expensive. Elections are expensive, and the LDP is really good at raising it. And those majorities don't fund themselves. And so, if you're the LDP and you have an overwhelming advantage when it comes to raising money, are you going to unilaterally disarm? I mean, it makes sense. And it makes sense that, of course, smaller parties want more restrictions because they've been more dependent on public funding, and the LDP has been able to supplement public funding with all sorts of private funding. So, so the LDP says, Ishin, no, sorry, that's a non-starter. Ishin then turns around and says, okay, fine. If we can't do that, well, we've had this other political reform idea that's been sort of one of our core ideas for a long time. And that is there are too many Diet members. And so let's eliminate 10%. And
love this, by the way.
Huh?
I love this as an idea.
And this is, and I mean, I actually hate it because when you do the math, like the sort of lawmaker per, per capita number. I mean, the United States has way too few, like Japan has way more representatives, fewer voters to representative ratio than the United States has, even though Japan, the United States has basically 3 times as many people, more or less. And so, I think it is good when there are lots of national representatives. I think it is good when you have, having worked for a Diet member and seen, the relative lack of distance between lawmakers, national lawmakers, and voters. That I think that is a good thing. And when that ratio is lower, you have more opportunities to actually see your representatives and interact with your representatives and be listened to by your representatives. And so, I mean, frankly, I think there's no reason, I think, for Japan to cut the number of lawmakers. I think for Ishin, I think, some of it has to do with an urban-rural, split where, the system is still, there's been some correction and you have had, some shift of representation, to Japan cities, but relatively speaking, urban Japan is still relatively underrepresented, and so of course this is a party that is centered in Japan's second city. They see if there are too many seats, it means there's too much representation for rural Japan. We need to fix that, and this is sort of a kind of a blunt instrument for fixing that. I think ultimately is how they see that. But anyway, so they come back and they say, this is our counter proposal. We have to do this. And not only do you have to do this, we're not going to accept, we'll study the issue and maybe we'll introduce legislation at some point. Maybe we'll do it next year. They said it has to be done during the Diet session that started yesterday. So you have until the end of the year to draw up this legislation and get it done. And basically so Takaichi said, fine, we'll do it. We're on board. She did not really run this by her party. And so immediately members of the LDP are like, wait a second, this is not This is not like, what seats do you plan on cutting? Like, whose seats exactly are going to be on the chopping block here? And so immediately you start getting pushback from within the LDP. Immediately you have the Secretary General of the LDP saying on, I believe it was yesterday, saying, actually, this is going to be kind of difficult to do. Again, one day after they had signed an agreement saying, we are going to do this during the current diet session. And you also have some pushback from other parties who are basically saying, like, you can't make a change like this without getting buy-in from all parties. Like, this is too big of a reform, to just be something that, oh, we're the government and therefore we can just sort of at a stroke get rid of a bunch of seats. And so, like, they're basically now setting up a pretty like brutal fight over this that is going to be within the LDP, between the LDP and Ishin, between the government and the opposition parties. Public opinion, I think, has not really weighed in on this yet because, like, basically this, they basically had like a week to process this. And some of those voters who may feel like they're going to lose representation may have thoughts about this.
How do they kick people off the island? I mean, that was why I was so excited about this, is just like the Hunger Games nature of, like,
well, it doesn't, I mean, it
cut.
wouldn't, it wouldn't, it wouldn't happen until, the next election. So basically,
Okay.
like in the same way that, like, they do redistricting between elections, which basically just means, like, we're eliminating this district, like, good luck, finding another, which does create like a Survivor kind of thing where, like, you'll have, like in some of these, sort of depopulating prefectures, oh, well, you had 4 constituencies, now you're only going to have 3, and that means, whoever was representing,
whoever gets the most donations from Toshiba gets to
I mean, you basically end up with these scrambles. And actually, I mean, and it's not just, you'll have had someone who was actually holding the seat in the constituency that got eliminated, but, like, other parties will have had candidates in that constituency who are like, well, wait, I want to run for a seat. Like, why does the person in this other constituency automatically get to run? So, you do get sort of like a musical chair situation, right? Where you're, like, taking the chair away and, like, you're running around in circles trying to be the one who ends up in the chair. So that's fun. There's talk that if they were to do it, it would mostly, both in the upper and the lower houses, the electoral systems are mixed, where you have, some constituency seats, and then some proportional representation seats. So there's talk that basically they would just, like, with a stroke of a pen, eliminate the number of proportional representation seats, which has small parties really upset because, who likes having lots of proportional representation seats? Small parties. The LDP, I mean, in some ways, the LDP would probably stand to gain the most from even more than Ishin, because, frankly, the LDP does best in the constituencies. Small parties have a really hard time winning constituency seats. And so, do you have fewer proportional seats? Okay, fine. Like, we're still going to probably do fine in those. Plus, we're going to, win a lot of constituency seats. So, it's, the interests of this kind of slice a lot of different directions. It is a big change. It is a big change to kind of spring on everyone, and they only have 2 months to figure it out. So, we'll see.
Any other dynamics? Japan first?
Yeah, we haven't really talked that much about things with the United States, which, Trump will be in Japan in less than a week now. And in fact, I think by a week from now, he'll be on his way home. So, Takaichi gets a test pretty quickly, right out of the gate. I think, there's been these articles in the last couple of weeks, when it was unclear when Japan would actually have a new prime minister. A lot of fretting from the foreign ministry about the new prime minister not having enough time to be briefed properly. And, when Ishiba first met Trump earlier this year, he basically had it was fine, but it was like, he did like 36 hours of briefings, and they're like, we want to do at least that much. And so the new prime minister has to be in place by this date so that, he or she can actually get that done. I think it'll be fine. There's already talk that it's going to be kind of like an Abe nostalgia tour for Trump. They're going to go to a lot of the same stops that he
Oh,
did.
that's
He
smart.
went with Abe the last time he came in 2019, and he's going to meet with Abe's widow Akie, and Takaichi. At least in the near term, she'll be able to play that Abe card. The fact that that she was so close to him, and they can bond over kind of shared affection, and that will, I think, um play, I think, a part in ensuring that at least this initial meeting goes well. I think it probably also explains why right off the bat she said, like, we're going to move quickly to raise defense spending. Well, I mean, in practice, that's something that is still going to take time to work out the details of, but being able to say, hey, last week I became prime minister and the first thing I said that we're doing is raising defense spending. That's not a bad thing to be able to say. Um, she made, as foreign minister, it's Motegi. Okay, well, Motegi's calling card has been, I negotiated a trade deal with Trump during the first Trump administration, and he called me a tough negotiator. And so I'm gonna be able to, to really, build a good relationship. And so, the relationship's in good hands. Akazawa, who was, who negotiated the trade deal for Ishiba, he's still in the cabinet, in a different role, but I think will still, probably be a channel for communication. And so in the near term, things will probably be okay. Um, there's still the bigger questions though, which is, just how interested is this administration in Asia in the first place? Just how durable is, the, commitment to defend Japan? Just how, you know, um, committed is Trump to, uh, having a kind of mutually beneficial trading relationship with Japan? I mean, I think there's some real questions about, the trade deal that was signed, and some questions about how that will be implemented. But, in some ways, all of those questions are kind of questions for after next week. Next week is, will they get along? What sort of relationship will they have off the bat? And, I suspect it will be fine.
She just I think this is helpful having being a Paul through and through, just knowing she's just got to subsume herself to this. I mean, she's also had a lot of experience, presumably subsuming herself to horrific male egos over the course of her career. So, just having to hold that for 2 days. I don't know. We're rooting for you. I feel like she's got it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, honestly, I think, it's going to be, it'll be nerve wracking, and, everyone will be watching just to see what the rapport is like. But, I think, I mean, just from what we've seen of Trump, I mean, to the extent that we can understand his feelings, I mean, certainly the way he talks about Abe suggests like a real, genuine affection. To the extent that he feels genuine affection for anyone. I mean, there does actually seem to be like a real, real sentiment there, and that, so that will, I think, the fact that she really does, um, you know, certainly shares that affection, I think will go a long way. Like, I think that even if Abe had been alive and was, somehow prime minister again, I don't think Abe was getting a pass on April 2nd. And, you'd still have to negotiate, sort of clawing back things to, a better level. It's still trying to find a package that, would make Trump happy. And I think what you would have ended up getting something, I think, that probably looks pretty similar to what Japan ended up getting. Because ultimately, I think also Japan's interests are Japan's interests, and I think any Japanese government would try to hold the line in much the same way, that Ishiba tried. So Takaichi, to the extent that she does things that this administration wants Japan to do, i.e., raising defense spending, contributing more to host nation support, signing up for, economic security measures with China, like, to the extent that that Japan does what the United States wants it to do, the friction can be minimized. But, the question is there a point at which, um, the Trump administration is asking things of Japan that they don't want to do. Or, as Takaichi herself said during the LDP leadership campaign, is there a point at which this idea of Japan's going to give us $550 billion, if the actual mechanics of that end up being very unfair for Japan, is there a point at which it actually becomes very hard for Takaichi or any Japanese leader to say, actually, no, we can't go along with this? We don't know yet because we're still waiting really for the details on how that's going to work. But that's a real question. Takaichi is a nationalist. She wants to stand up for a strong Japan, and that includes if the United States is doing something that makes Japan look weak or feels like Japan is not its interests are being harmed. I think she will be in a position where she has to say no and stand up for that. And this is the kind of duality of of the Japanese right, where of course, they are very committed to the alliance with the United States. There's been an appreciation that alliance with the United States was sort of the best pathway to bolster Japan's own strength, to make Japan relevant, to make Japan important, and just as a matter of practicality, that Japan needs the United States for its security in the region. But there also has been in some corners, it's outright anti-American. In other corners, it's just, kind of America-phobic or America frustrated or America skeptic. And recognizing that actually, often we're not aligned 100% on everything. And I think, sometimes, certainly when Democrats have been president, but not only Democrats, that there's a feeling that, the values of the United States are not necessarily our values. And for the right wing, a lot of times, that's history issues. You've had Republicans criticize Japan for history issues. It's almost funny to think that the George W. Bush administration and Abe had a little fight over, over the comfort women issue, which just is really weird to think about, but, that happened. You had Republicans in Congress criticizing Abe for things he was saying about the comfort women issue. So they have a complicated relationship with America, I think, is really the bottom line when it comes down to Japan's right.
So I started listening to this podcast. It's called the R. Bill Simmons podcast, and it's basically like a meta podcast about the BS report and how Bill Simmons podcasting has changed and gotten worse over time. And one of the main critiques is basically like, he doesn't watch the games anymore. His heart's not in it. He doesn't even know what he's talking about. He's just making dumb jokes. I remember whenever I do a show with you about Japan, Tobias, I feel like I'm inhabiting the post-pandemic Bill Simmons energy when it comes to podcasting, because on the tech and China stuff, I actually know what I'm talking about, but not at all when it comes to this minutia, inter-Japanese party drama. So I would like to thank you, Tobias, for your patience. I would like to thank the audience as well for their patience as I go on this very long journey trying to understand a little bit more about this country. Thank you to the U.S.-Japan Foundation for sponsoring this podcast. But Tobias, this is always a pleasure. I learned a ton. Cannot wait to check in a few months once the government falls apart or not. But to be sure, there'll be plenty of more drama to come.
Take care.